The crisp September air carried an ominous stillness as dawn broke over the rolling hills of Sharpsburg, Maryland on September 17, 1862. What began as a peaceful Tuesday morning would soon transform into the single bloodiest day in American military history, forever altering the course of the Civil War and the fate of millions enslaved souls. General Robert Edward Lee stood atop a small ridge, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his horse traveler, surveying the Antietam Creek Valley below. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, though battle-hardened and determined, appeared dangerously stretched thin across the Maryland countryside. Lee's audacious invasion of Union territory represented a desperate gamble, one that could either secure European recognition for the Confederacy or spell catastrophe for the Southern cause. Across the creek, Union Major General George Brinton McClellan commanded the Army of the Potomac, a force nearly twice the size of Lee's army. McClellan, known to his men as Little Mac, possessed an almost supernatural ability to organize and inspire troops, yet his cautious nature had previously cost the Union crucial victories. This morning, however, destiny demanded boldness. Night before, a Confederate courier had accidentally dropped Lee's detailed battle plans, wrapped around 3 cigars, near a Union campsite. When Union soldiers discovered these orders, known as the Lost Order or Special Order 191, they had delivered invaluable intelligence directly into McClellan's hands. For once, the methodical general knew exactly where Lee intended to position his divided forces. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the morning mist, Union artillery began its thunderous prelude to carnage. The 6th Corps, under Major General William Buell Franklin, prepared to assault the Confederate left flank near Dunker Church, a simple white building that would soon become synonymous with unspeakable horror. Confederate Brigadier General John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade had spent a restless night positioned in a cornfield north of the church. The corn stood tall and golden, ready for harvest, its peaceful rustling in the morning breeze belying the violence about to unfold within its rows. Hood's men, many of them barely 20 years old, checked their muskets and whispered prayers. Knowing that death stalked the dawn, Private Samuel Thompson of the 1st Texas Infantry clutched a letter from his sweetheart back in Houston, his hands trembling not from fear but from the terrible certainty of what lay ahead. Around him, his comrades from the Lone Star State prepared for what many sensed would be their final charge. The Texans had earned a fearsome reputation throughout Virginia, but nothing had prepared them for the mechanized slaughter awaiting. In that innocent cornfield, McClellan's plan called for a coordinated assault across multiple fronts, designed to prevent Lee from shifting reinforcements between threatened positions. The 1st Corps, commanded by Major General Joseph Hooker, would spearhead the northern attack through the corn, while the 9th Corps under Major General Ambrose Everett Burnside would simultaneously assault the stone bridge spanning Antietam Creek to the south. According to historical accounts documented in the National Archives, Lee commanded approximately 40,000 men, while McClellan possessed nearly 87,000 troops. Yet the Confederate general's tactical brilliance and his soldiers' desperate courage would transform numerical disadvantage into strategic opportunity throughout the coming battle. As church bells chimed 7 o'clock in nearby Sharpsburg, the 1st Union Infantry regiments emerged from the woods north of the cornfield. Their blue uniforms created a striking contrast against the golden stalks as they advanced in perfect formation, bayonets glinting in the strengthening sunlight. Behind them, artillery batteries wheeled into position, their bronze cannons aimed at the Confederate lines barely visible through the corn. The stage was set for unprecedented carnage. Before this September day concluded, over 23,000 Americans would become casualties, more than had fallen in all previous battles of the war combined. The cornfield, the church, the creek, and a simple stone bridge would be forever stained with blood, their names etched into the nation's collective memory as symbols of sacrifice, courage, and the terrible price of preserving the Union. At 7:30 that morning, the relative peace shattered like glass against stone. Major General Joseph Hooker's First Corps advanced into the cornfield with approximately 8,000 Union soldiers, their rifles loaded and bayonets fixed. The golden stalks, standing nearly as tall as a man, created a natural maze that would transform orderly battle formations into desperate individual struggles for survival. Brigadier General John Bell Hood's Confederate defenders, positioned along the southern edge of the field, waited with the patience of seasoned predators. The 2nd and 21st Georgia Infantry Regiments lay concealed among the corn rows, their muskets aimed at the advancing blue uniforms barely visible through the dense stalks. Hood had instructed his men to hold their fire until the Yankees came within 50 yards, close enough to ensure maximum devastation. Private William McCarthy of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry felt his heart pounding as he pushed through the corn, each step forward bringing him deeper into what felt increasingly like a golden trap. The stalks rustled ominously around him, and the morning sun, filtered through countless leaves, created an almost dreamlike quality that contrasted sharply with the deadly reality unfolding. Suddenly, the Confederate line erupted in a thunderous volley that seemed to shake the very earth. Hundreds of musket balls tore through the corn stalks like invisible scythes, cutting down Union soldiers who never saw their attackers. Men screamed and fell, their blood mixing with the rich Maryland soil as the golden field began its transformation into a harvest of death. The Iron Brigade, Wisconsin's finest regiment, absorbed the initial Confederate assault with characteristic determination. These veteran soldiers, recognizable by their distinctive black hats, had earned their nickname through countless battles across Virginia. Now they found themselves trading volleys in conditions that reduced warfare to its most primitive and brutal essence. Colonel Solomon Meredith, commanding the Iron Brigade, rallied his men for a countercharge through the corn. His voice carried above the musket fire as he urged his soldiers forward, knowing that hesitation meant annihilation. The Wisconsin men responded with fierce courage, their own rifles blazing as they pushed deeper into the field. Hood's Texans met this advance with equal ferocity. The 1st Texas Infantry, led by Lieutenant Colonel Philip Augustus Work, poured devastating fire into the Union ranks. These men from the frontier had grown up with rifles in their hands, and their marksmanship proved deadly in the close-quarters combat among the corn stalks. The battle in the cornfield quickly devolved into chaos as formations dissolved, and soldiers fought individual duels among the golden rows. Men fired at muzzle flashes glimpsed through the stalks, never knowing if their targets were friend or foe until too late. The corn itself became a casualty, stalks cut down by bullets and trampled by struggling soldiers. As documented in Harper's weekly reports from the battlefield, the cornfield changed hands multiple times during the morning hours. Units would advance, take casualties, retreat, regroup, and advance again in an endless cycle of violence that consumed men and material at an alarming rate. Captain Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin later wrote that the corn seemed to fall as orderly as if cut by a giant scythe, but beneath each fallen stalk lay wounded or dying soldiers from both armies. The imagery haunted survivors for decades, nature's bounty transformed into humanity's nightmare. Union artillery, positioned on higher ground north of the field, began dropping shells into the Confederate positions. The explosions added a new dimension of terror as shrapnel scattered through the corn, wounding men who had survived the musket volleys. Confederate return fire from Captain William Thomas Pogue's battery created deadly crossfire that caught Union reinforcements advancing toward the field. By 9 o'clock, both armies had fed regiment after regiment into the cornfields insatiable. The Iron Brigade had suffered devastating casualties, while Hood's Texas Brigade faced annihilation. Fresh Confederate reinforcements under Brigadier General Roswell Sabine Ripley arrived just as Union pressure threatened to break through. The southern end of the field, the cornfield, had become America's killing ground, where courage and horror walked hand in hand among the golden stalks, each step forward purchased with blood as the morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the blood-soaked cornfield. The battle's focus shifted toward a simple, white structure that would become one of the war's most recognizable landmarks. The Dunker Church, built by German Baptist brethren who advocated pacifism, stood ironically at the epicenter of unprecedented violence that would define September 17th as America's bloodiest single day. Major General Edwin Vos Sumner, commanding the Union Second Corps, received orders to support Hooker's battered First Corps around 10 o'clock. Sumner, at 65, the oldest Corps commander in the Army of the Potomac, possessed decades of military experience but had never witnessed carnage on this scale. His 3 divisions, nearly 15,000 men, represented McClellan's attempt to exploit the gaps torn in Confederate lines by the cornfield fighting. Brigadier General John Sedgwick's division spearheaded Sumner's advance, moving south toward the church through the western edge of the now devastated cornfield. These veteran soldiers, many from Philadelphia and New York regiments, stepped carefully around the bodies of their comrades from earlier assaults. The corn stalks, cut down by bullets and artillery, created a carpet of gold mixed with crimson that crunched beneath their boots. Confederate Major General Daniel Harvey Hill watched this new Union advance with growing alarm. His division, already bloodied from the cornfield fighting, held positions near the church with barely 4,000 effective soldiers remaining. Hill knew that if Sumner's massive force broke through, Lee's entire left flank would collapse, potentially ending the Confederate invasion of Maryland in catastrophic defeat. The church itself, painted brilliant white and gleaming in the morning sunlight, served as a navigation point for both armies. Confederate artillery spotters used its steeple to direct fire, while Union officers oriented their advancing columns on its distinctive architecture. Neither side intended disrespect to the peaceful congregation that normally gathered within its walls, but war transformed even the most sacred spaces into tactical objectives. As Sedgwick's division approached the church, they encountered the reformed remnants of Hood's Texas Brigade and the 3rd Arkansas Infantry. These Confederate survivors, their uniforms torn and blackened with powder smoke, occupied positions among the trees and stone walls surrounding the building. Despite their losses, they maintained the fierce determination that had made them legendary throughout the Army of Northern Virginia. The encounter began with scattered rifle fire as Confederate skirmishers engaged the Union advance guard. Captain James Fleming of the 15th Massachusetts Infantry led his company forward, using the church's white walls as cover while they returned fire. The juxtaposition struck many soldiers as profoundly disturbing, using a house of worship as protection while attempting to kill fellow Americans. According to battlefield correspondence preserved in the Library of Congress, Major General Lafayette McLaws arrived with Confederate reinforcements just as Sedgwick's assault reached its climax. McLaws commanded 2 fresh brigades that had completed a forced march from Harper's Ferry, their arrival representing Lee's desperate attempt to prevent total collapse of his Maryland campaign. The fighting around Dunker Church intensified as McLaws men deployed along the ridge south of the building. Brigadier General Joseph Brevard Kershaw's South Carolina Brigade took positions behind a stone wall that provided excellent defensive cover. These soldiers, many of them plantation owners and their sons, fought with the desperation of men defending their entire way of life. Union artillery, directed by Captain Joseph Clark Ames, began shelling the Confederate positions around the church. The bombardment created a hellish scene as shells exploded among the trees, sending splinters and stone fragments flying in all directions. Several rounds struck the church itself. Though the sturdy German construction prevented major structural damage, Private Michael O'Brien of the 69th New York Infantry, part of the famous Irish Brigade, advanced with fixed bayonet toward the stone wall defending the church approaches. Around him, his fellow Irish Americans pressed forward despite devastating Confederate fire, their emerald battle flag streaming in the smoke-filled air. The church grounds became a maze of individual combats as formations broke down under the intensity of close-quarters fighting. Men fought hand-to-hand among the grave markers. The peaceful cemetery transformed into an extension of the battlefield, where the living joined the dead with shocking regularity. While the battle raged around Dunkirk Church, another Union assault was developing 2 miles south along a quiet country road that would earn the most ominous nickname in American military history. The Bloody Lane, known locally as the Sunken Road, appeared deceptively peaceful in the morning light, a simple farm path worn down by decades of wagon traffic between Sharpsburg and Boone. Major General Daniel Harvey Hill had positioned approximately 2,500 Confederate soldiers along this natural trench, recognizing its defensive potential. The road's sunken nature, carved 3 to 4 feet below the surrounding farmland by years of erosion, provided excellent cover for riflemen, while offering clear fields of fire across the approaching terrain. Brigadier General Robert Emmett Rhodes commanded the Alabama Brigade, occupying the eastern section of the lane. These soldiers from the heart of Dixie had distinguished themselves in previous battles, but nothing had prepared them for the sustained assault about to unfold. Rhodes positioned his men carefully, ensuring maximum utilization of the road's natural defensive advantages. At approximately 10:30, Union Major General William Henry French received orders to assault the Confederate center. French commanded the 3rd Division of Sumner's 2nd Corps, roughly 4,000 soldiers drawn primarily from New York and Delaware regiments. These men, many of them recent recruits, would face their baptism of fire in one of the war's most concentrated killing zones. The approach to Bloody Lane crossed 800 yards of open farmland, recently harvested and offering virtually no cover for advancing infantry. French's men formed traditional assault columns, their blue uniforms creating a striking contrast against the brown stubble of the harvested fields. Regimental flags fluttered in the morning breeze as drummers beat the cadence for what many soldiers sensed would be their final march. Confederate defenders watched this magnificent yet terrible spectacle with grim fascination. Colonel John Brown Gordon of the 6th Alabama Infantry, positioned at the center of the sunken road, instructed his men to hold their fire until the Yankees reached optimal range. Gordon, destined to become one of the Confederacy's most celebrated generals, understood that discipline would determine survival in the coming slaughter. The Union assault began with characteristic courage as French's regiments advanced across the open ground. The 130th Pennsylvania Infantry, commanded by Colonel Henry Irwin Zinn, led the attack with parade ground precision despite the obvious danger ahead. These citizen soldiers from Philadelphia and surrounding counties had volunteered to preserve the Union, never imagining they would face annihilation in a Maryland cornfield when the advancing Union line reached 200 yards from the sunken road. The Confederate defenders rose like apparitions from the earth and delivered a devastating volley. Hundreds of muskets fired simultaneously, creating a thunderclap that echoed across the battlefield. The effect on French's assault columns proved catastrophic as entire companies crumpled under the concentrated fire. Private Jacob Miller of the 114th Pennsylvania Infantry described the Confederate volley as resembling a giant scythe cutting through wheat. Men fell in windrows, their bodies marking the furthest advance of each successive assault wave. The mathematical precision of the slaughter horrified even veteran soldiers accustomed to battlefield carnage. French's division recoiled from this initial repulse, but Union artillery quickly began counter-battery fire against Confederate positions. Captain Ames' batteries, repositioned from the Dunker Church fighting, sent shells screaming toward the sunken road. The explosions created geysers of earth and smoke, but the road's depth protected most offenders from direct hits. As documented in the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, Brigadier General Richardson's division arrived to reinforce French's battered units around noon. Richardson, known throughout the Army as Fighting Dick, brought fresh regiments including the famous Irish Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Thomas Francis Marr. The Irish Brigade's assault on Bloody Lane represented one of the war's most gallant and tragic episodes. These soldiers, many of them recent immigrants from the Emerald Isle, advanced with their distinctive green battle flags while their chaplain, Father William Corby, pronounced general absolution for the living and the dead. The sunken road began filling with bodies as successive Union assaults met concentrated Confederate fire. What had begun as a natural defensive position gradually transformed into America's most notorious killing field. 3 miles southeast of the carnage at Bloody Lane, another drama of extraordinary courage and devastating loss unfolded at a narrow stone bridge spanning Antietam Creek. This simple 3-arch structure, built by local farmers for peaceful commerce, would become forever known as Burnside Bridge, named for the Union general whose repeated assaults transformed it into one of the war's most contested landmarks. Major General Ambrose Everett Burnside commanded the Union 9th Corps, positioned on the eastern bank of Antietam Creek since dawn. Burnside, a West Point graduate with distinctive whiskers that would inspire the term sideburns, faced a tactical nightmare that would test both his military skill and his soldiers' devotion. The bridge, barely 12 feet wide, represented the only viable crossing point for miles in either direction, creating a deadly bottleneck that Confederate defenders could easily target. Brigadier General Robert Augustus Toombs, a former United States Senator from Georgia, commanded the Confederate forces defending the bridge with fewer than 400 soldiers from the 2nd and 20th Georgia Infantry Regiments. Toombs recognized the bridge's strategic importance and positioned his men in rifle pits carved into the steep bluffs overlooking the creek. These elevated positions provided perfect fields of fire while offering excellent protection from Union artillery. The stone bridge itself measured 125 feet in length, with low parapets on either side that provided minimal protection for attacking infantry. Confederate engineers had partially dismantled the eastern approach, forcing Union soldiers to bunch together as they attempted to cross the narrow span. This natural funnel created what military historians would later describe as a perfect killing zone. At 10 o'clock, Burnside received McClellan's orders to assault the bridge and establish a foothold on the western bank. The mission appeared straightforward on paper, but the tactical reality proved far more complex. Union artillery attempted to suppress Confederate defenders, but the elevated positions and stone fortifications limited the effectiveness of the bombardment. Colonel George Crook of the 36th Ohio Infantry received the honor of leading the first assault. His regiment, recruited from the hills of southeastern Ohio, possessed the fighting spirit of frontier soldiers, but lacked experience in coordinated assaults against prepared positions. Crook understood the bridge's dangers but believed rapid movement might minimize casualties. The first Union assault began with remarkable courage as Ohio soldiers charged across the narrow span. Confederate defenders, hidden in their elevated rifle pits, waited until the advancing column reached the bridge's center before opening fire. The concentrated volley proved devastating, cutting down the assault's leaders and creating a pile of bodies that blocked further advance. Private Burnham Wardwell of the 11th Connecticut Infantry watched in horror as successive assault waves met similar fates. The bridge's narrow width prevented flanking maneuvers while its length exposed attacking soldiers to sustained fire throughout their advance. Wardwell later wrote that the stone parapets became slippery with blood. making footing treacherous. For soldiers attempting to cross Tombs, Georgian defenders maintained their positions despite repeated Union assaults and continuous artillery bombardment. These soldiers, many of them farmers and small-town merchants before the war, displayed remarkable discipline under pressure. Their elevated positions allowed plunging fire that proved especially deadly against troops bunched together on the Vanda. Narrow Bridge. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Georgia Historical Society, Colonel William Raymond Lee of the 20th Georgia encouraged his men by reminding them they were fighting for their homes and families. The Georgians responded with accurate rifle fire that turned each Union assault into a catastrophe, littering the bridge with casualties. Union frustration mounted as repeated attacks failed to secure the crossing. Burnside committed regiment after regiment to the bridge assault, each attack following the same tragic pattern. Soldiers would advance courageously across the span only to meet concentrated Confederate fire that decimated their ranks before they could establish defensive positions on the western bank. The 51st New York Infantry and 51st Pennsylvania Infantry finally succeeded in crossing the bridge around 1 o'clock, but only after suffering enormous casualties. Their success came at the cost of hundreds of brave soldiers whose bodies marked the price of those precious few yards of Maryland. Countryside. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the blood-soaked battlefield, the momentum of battle began shifting decisively in favor of the Union forces. The successful crossing at Burnside Bridge, purchased with such terrible sacrifice, finally provided McClellan with the breakthrough opportunity he had sought since dawn. Confederate General Robert Edward Lee faced the nightmare scenario he had feared most: simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts that stretched his already thin lines beyond their breaking point. Burnside's 9th Corps, having finally secured the Stone Bridge, began deploying on the western bank of Antietam Creek around 2 o'clock. Nearly 9,000 Union soldiers crossed the narrow span throughout the afternoon, their blue uniforms creating an ever-expanding presence on Confederate territory. Brigadier General Isaac Peace Rodman's division had discovered a ford downstream from the bridge, allowing additional Union forces to outflank Toombs' exhausted Georgian defenders. The Confederate position grew increasingly precarious as Union forces established artillery batteries on the western heights. Captain Samuel Noel Benjamin's battery unlimbered their guns with clear fields of fire toward Sharpsburg, the small Maryland town that served as Lee's headquarters and supply depot. These cannon represented a direct threat to Confederate communications and retreat routes, forcing Lee to consider options he had hoped to avoid. In Sharpsburg itself, Confederate wounded filled every available building as the town transformed into a massive field hospital. Local civilians, despite their mixed loyalties, assisted Confederate surgeons overwhelmed by the unprecedented casualties. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Union's innovative medical director, would later document how the battle's intensity exceeded all previous experience in treating battlefield injuries. Lee surveyed the deteriorating situation from his command post near the town center, his weathered face betraying the strain of commanding an army facing potential annihilation. Traveler, his faithful mount, seemed to sense his master's concern as artillery shells began falling closer to Confederate headquarters. The general who had won stunning victories at Bull Run and the 7 Days Campaign now confronted the possibility of complete defeat on Union soil. Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's division, still marching frantically from Harper's Ferry, represented Lee's last hope for stabilizing the collapsing situation. Hill, known throughout the Army for his aggressive fighting style and distinctive red battle shirt, had pushed his men mercilessly throughout the morning. These soldiers, exhausted from their forced march but still capable of fighting, could potentially arrive in time to prevent total disaster. Confederate Artillery Commander Colonel Stephen Dill Lee positioned his remaining guns to cover the Army's potential retreat routes toward the Potomac River fords. These cannons, many of them captured from Union forces in previous battles, represented the Army of Northern Virginia's last mobile reserve. Their crews, blackened with powder smoke and exhausted from 12 hours of continuous firing, prepared for what might be their final stand. Union pressure continued mounting as McClellan finally committed his reserves to exploit Confederate weakness. The 5th Corps, commanded by Major General John Porter, had remained in reserve throughout the morning, but now advanced to support Burnside's breakthrough. Porter's men, fresh and eager for combat, represented overwhelming force against Lee's decimated defenders. The psychological impact of the Union breakthrough began affecting Confederate morale as word spread through the ranks that Yankee forces had crossed Antietam Creek in strength. Soldiers who had fought magnificently throughout the morning began glancing toward their rear, calculating distances to the Potomac River fords that offered their only escape route from Maryland. Confederate Brigadier General David Rumph Jones, commanding the division responsible for defending Sharpsburg's immediate approaches, reported to Lee that his men could not withstand another major assault. Jones's soldiers, drawn from South Carolina and Virginia regiments, had fought courageously but faced overwhelming odds as Union forces converged on their positions, as documented in Confederate field reports, preserved at the Museum of the Confederacy. Ammunition shortages began affecting Southern units throughout the line. Soldiers reduced to fewer than 10 cartridges per man could not maintain the intensive fire that had characterized the morning's fighting. This logistical crisis, combined with mounting casualties, threatened to render Confederate resistance ineffective within hours. The stage was set for the battle's climactic phase, where Lee's tactical genius would face its ultimate test against overwhelming Union numerical superiority. As the September afternoon wore on, what appeared to be inevitable Union victory transformed into one of the most remarkable escapes in military history. The arrival of Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's division at the crucial moment would save Lee's army from complete destruction and preserve the Confederacy for nearly 3 more years of devastating conflict. At approximately 3:30, Hill's lead elements appeared on the battlefield after completing one of the war's most legendary forced marches. The general himself, wearing his distinctive red battle shirt, rode ahead of his troops to assess the desperate situation facing Lee's army. Hill's men, though exhausted from their 17-mile march from Harper's Ferry, represented the only fresh Confederate troops available to stem the Union advance, the Light Division, as Hill's command was known throughout the Army of Northern Virginia, deployed with remarkable speed despite their fatigue. Brigadier General Maxcy Gregg's South Carolina Brigade took position south of Sharpsburg, directly in the path of Burnside's advancing 9th Corps. These soldiers from the Palmetto State, many of them educated gentlemen who had volunteered to defend their homeland, prepared to face overwhelming odds with characteristic Southern courage. Union forces, sensing victory within their grasp, pressed their advantage across multiple fronts. Burnside's corps advanced methodically toward Sharpsburg, while artillery fire began falling in the town's streets. Confederate civilians who had remained during the battle now fled toward the Potomac River fords, their belongings hastily loaded onto whatever transportation they could find. The climactic moment arrived when Hill's artillery, commanded by Captain David Gregg McIntosh, unlimbered their guns on a ridge overlooking the Union advance. These Confederate cannons, served by crews who had learned their deadly craft in previous battles, opened fire at point-blank range against surprised Union infantry. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical casualties, as Union soldiers who thought victory assured suddenly faced fresh Confederate resistance. Brigadier General Orlando Bolivar Wilcox's Union Division, leading Burnside's assault on Sharpsburg, encountered Hill's counterattack just as they approached the town's outskirts. The 9th Michigan Infantry, advancing confidently toward what appeared to be demoralized Confederate defenders, suddenly faced disciplined volleys from Gregg's South Carolinians. The surprise and intensity of this resistance stopped the Union advance in its tracks. Lee, observing Hill's timely arrival from his headquarters, immediately grasped the opportunity to stabilize his collapsing lines. The Confederate commander, displaying the tactical brilliance that had earned him legendary status, quickly repositioned his remaining reserves to support Hill's counterattack. Every available Confederate soldier, including walking wounded and headquarters personnel, joined the desperate effort to prevent Union breakthrough into Sharpsburg, the fighting around. Sharpsburg's outskirts reached unprecedented intensity as both armies committed everything to this final struggle. Hill's men, despite their exhaustion, fought with the fury of soldiers who understood they were preventing total Confederate collapse. The 14th South Carolina Infantry, commanded by Colonel Dixon Barnes, engaged in vicious hand-to-hand combat with Union soldiers who had advanced too far beyond their supporting artillery. As evening approached, the Union advance finally stalled against determined Confederate resistance. Burnside, recognizing that his corps had suffered enormous casualties throughout the day's fighting, ordered his men to consolidate their positions rather than continue costly assaults against prepared defenses. The momentum that had seemed to promise Union victory gradually dissipated as darkness fell over the battlefield. According to official casualty reports compiled after the battle, the Army of the Potomac suffered over 12,000 casualties, while Confederate losses exceeded 10,000 men. These figures, representing nearly 25% of all engaged forces, made September 17th the bloodiest single day in American military history. Lee used the cover of darkness to begin withdrawing his battered army across the Potomac River into Virginia. The Confederate invasion of Maryland had failed, but the Army of Northern Virginia survived to fight another day. This survival, achieved through extraordinary courage and Hill's timely arrival, would prolong the Civil War for nearly 3 additional years. President Lincoln, learning of the Union tactical victory, finally possessed the political capital necessary to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation 5 days later. The battle that had begun as a struggle for military advantage ultimately transformed the war's fundamental purpose from preserving the Union to ending slavery forever.